Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening to you, wherever in the world you are dialing into us today. My name is Samantha Custer. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis for AidData. We're a research lab based at William & Mary, a leading public university in the United States. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to serve as your moderator for today's discussion entitled Cooperation Amid Crisis: How can multilateral organizations position themselves to help countries mitigate and manage shocks? So easy question for us to tackle in about an hour and a half. So let's put our seatbelts on and get ready to go. For those of you that haven't heard of us before, just as a brief word of introduction, AidData works with policymakers and practitioners all over the world. We do a lot of different things, but I often like to say that our work ultimately builds to answering a single overarching question: who is funding what, where, and to what effect when it comes to development cooperation efforts? I should say that today's event is being co-hosted with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The impetus is to encourage greater discussion and debate of several key themes arising from their important 2022 Multilateral Development Finance report. It was launched last November. If you haven't read it, check it out, available on their website. We have a great lineup of speakers that are well positioned to tackle the headline questions for today's conversation from a variety of different vantage points. But I have to say, looking at the broader list of participants for today's event, we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the depth and breadth of expertise in our virtual room. So I'm very excited to hear from all of our featured speakers, but I very much hope to hear from all of you as well. So be on notice. I'm warning you now. I expect some poignant questions and insights in our interactive portion of our Q&A later on. You will make this, you'll get from this what you put into it. So put in a lot. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Just a few brief words at the top of the conversation today to set the stage. The last few years, to say this has been a turbulent time for development cooperation seems like an understatement, to say the least. COVID-19, as we know, was a universal shock to the international system. It affected countries across geographies, ideologies, income levels, and it forced policymakers to weigh trade-offs of emergency response with long-term development. If you think about the war in Ukraine that's happening right now, it not only placed an entire nation's sovereignty and well-being in jeopardy from an external aggressor, but it's also had global ripple effects in terms of questions of energy security, rising fuel prices, inflation, and the availability of essential supplies. Late last year, it comes to mind that I contributed to a panel discussion that deliberated whether the next international crisis would be not another pandemic, but a financial crisis, as countries pursued debt finance development at unsustainable levels with substantial risk of default. And of course, all of this is playing out on top of other episodic or cyclical crises that are perhaps more familiar to us, such as those from natural disasters, environmental factors, and also conflict and fragility. And perhaps this is why I think one of the major contentions of that OECD report that I referred to at the start is that the new normal has effectively become a succession of mutually reinforcing crises or shocks to the international system. And that for multilaterals to remain relevant in this new normal, they must find ways to adapt and respond to help countries mitigate and manage these crises while maintaining long-term development gains. And it's changing the landscape a little bit in terms of saying it's not just those specialized international actors anymore that are the folks that work on humanitarian assistance in crises. Crises are their game. Well, crises are everybody's game now. And it's important for us to adapt to that new normal. And then, of course, in the backdrop of all of this, in addition to the question of crises, there are other tectonic shifts in the global conversation about how countries relate to one another that are also shaping these questions around multilaterals. And I think of things like calls for the decolonization of aid, the resurgence of great power competition, the fraying or thinning of multilateralism. And yet, of course, we also know that we have real big, huge challenges facing our world that require collective action. And so it raises the question about, well, what does a new normal of contested cooperation look like, where actors do not always agree on the entirety of the development agenda, or they may have interests that are not always aligned, but where are they aligned? Where are those areas of convergence between multilaterals, their funding partners in the global north, as well as their counterparts in the global south? And so with that in mind, I really hope that this conversation is really a question around how do we make the supply of multilateralism fit for purpose and responsive to the demand that so many countries have for these highly credible, highly sought after partners. So what do leaders in the global south want from their partners? What do official contributors in the global north expect from multilaterals? And how well poised are multilateral institutions to deliver in line with their expectations? So with that, looking forward into a pretty dynamic conversation that we have set out today. So let me briefly say who I have joining us from around the world. And as I said before, really excited to have these folks joining us. So I first have Rachel Scott. She's a senior policy advisor at the OECD. She leads two portfolios of work, one related to the OECD's the OECD Development Assistance Committee's work on Ukraine and its downstream impacts, as well as her work with the Multilateral Performance Network, so MOPAN, on improving the performance of multilateral organizations working in crisis. And Rachel has a long track record well before that in working all over the world and thinking through questions of multilateralism in crisis. So welcome, Rachel. Our second panelist today is Anna Horikoshi. She is a senior research analyst at AidData, working with me on something called our Listening to Leaders survey of over 100,000 policymakers from 141 low and middle income countries around the world. Anna completed her PhD in economics. She has studied for years questions of foreign aid and its effects on different aspects of governance in developing countries. And so I think we'll have a lot to bring to the conversation today. Sharon Felser and I have I think I've worked with you for the longest, actually, Sharon, of anybody on the panel. Sharon, for 2.5 decades, if I'm not mistaken, headed up the World Bank's Strategic Insights Group. And in my parlance, and I'll let Sharon correct me later on in her remarks if she would like, but in my mind, probably one of the most thoughtful people working within multilateral organizations when it comes to what do the World Bank stakeholders think about the World Bank? How responsive is the World Bank to their priorities, their needs, and how do we continue to take these insights about what stakeholders want and put that into play in strategy? So really excited to have Sharon here. And of course, now that she's stepped back from her World Bank responsibilities, can even be more candid than perhaps if she was on the hot seat in the World Bank today. So excellent to have her on board as well. Last but certainly not least, Ambassador Jason Chung. He's currently a senior non-resident advisor with the Project on Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He previously served as the U.S. Director of the Asian Development Bank with the rank of ambassador, where he represented the United States on the board of directors. He previously served across various roles within the U.S. government, from Treasury to both local and federal level experience. So we'll bring an important perspective to bear on today's conversation. So with that, I think we'll go with a round of opening remarks. I asked each of the panelists to kind of think a little bit about the broad topic that we're discussing today, this question of cooperation amid crisis. How can multilateral organizations position themselves to help countries mitigate and manage shocks, and kind of taking into account some of that background that I provided. So I asked them to give us a couple of minutes of framing comments first, and then we'll dig into some of the details of different facets of this as we go throughout the conversation today. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rachel. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question coming from the OECD perspective.
Thanks so much for inviting me here today, and great to be here with everyone in this very esteemed panel. I feel very humble for being here, and thanks to the AidData and the OECD for hosting this. So as you mentioned, I work with MOPAN, which is the Multilateral Performance Network. That's a network of 22 member states who together invest about 80 billion a year in the multilateral system. And they come together as responsible shareholders and funders to look at the performance of the system and work together to improve that. So, I mean, I really liked your opening remarks. You came through the C's and the F's, and I wanted to add the T's to that, if that's okay. I mean, you talked us through COVID, conflict, climate, and then telling us that crises are everyone's game now, and I think that's absolutely right. The F's, you know, the fuel, fertilizer, and food crisis, and I'm very pleased you added financial there as well, because I think debt's going to be a big issue coming up. But the T's that I wanted to add, if that's all right, are around trustworthiness, trust, and together. And these are things that we're hearing very strongly from our members at the moment. So I wanted to start, if I may, on the trustworthiness side of things. You know, there is obviously either a breakdown or at least a need to build trust back in the multilateral system. And we've seen this, you know, through geopolitical movements at the moment, that trust is something that is lacking at the moment. So on the trustworthiness side, and, you know, how can multilaterals position themselves in this? What we're hearing a lot about is the need to put safeguards in place. And we will have a MOPAN event on safeguards later this year to look at actually what does that mean when you break it down, because safeguards is a very broad subject. It's also about the culture inside the multilateral system as well. We hear things about toxic culture, for example, and about how, you know, it's the needs of individuals rather than the needs of the whole, and certainly not the needs of what AidData is coming up with in the Listening to Leaders survey. That's sort of a primary, which is really unfortunate. And then there's other issues around inefficiencies and value for money. You know, how do we get back the organization so that the system itself and the organizations inside it are trustworthy and are focusing very clearly on the things that are coming out, for example, in your Listening to Leaders survey? So that would be the first part. The second is then, of course, trust. You know, how do we actually, once the system itself is moving towards trustworthiness, how do we build trust? What I hear a lot of, and we heard this at MOPAN's anniversary event last year as well, is, you know, if you would just give us more money, and if that money would be more flexible, well, we'd fix it all. You know, everything would be fixed, right? And of course, that's not, you know, that's a nice argument to make from the multilateral side, but that's not really going to make the difference, if you like. It's very naive sort of way to go about it. I mean, trust is earned. All of us who are parents and who are managers have understood that, I think, for a long time. And in that way, you know, how can we make governance systems inside the multilateral organizations and across the system itself work better, so that the needs that are coming out, you know, from the ground, from the member states, the wishes of the member states are going into the strategic directions of these organizations, and that the organizations are then being accountable to the member states, to their shareholders, if you like, for delivering on those goals. And then how can we make that sort of be around not just the longer term aims, because I think there's quite a bit of discussion about that at the moment, but also about how they approach these crises that you're talking about, where there is very little interaction, if you like, other than the funding arrangement with the member states. And with trust then comes earned autonomy, which I sort of, if I can explain, is about if you make sure that the way that the members want and the shareholders want the organization and the system to perform is happening, then in return, there should be a greater level of autonomy for the implementation of those strategies, as long as the accountability is there at the end. And that's maybe how we get around the earmarking thing. And then finally, just really quickly on the together, this is something we hear so much about. The system can't just be a number of multilateral organizations. And if you've read the Multilateral Development Finance report, there's a tremendous graphic in there showing the fragmentation across the system. Something like 45 different multilateral organizations working in the same sector in some cases. It's quite extraordinary. Do go look it up. But, you know, how can we get these organizations to work better together? What kind of incentives do we need to provide to do that? So that the needs of people in developing countries, the needs of people facing crises, and the longer term development needs are clearly and squarely happening, because the system is working together with a coherent effort and making synergies going forward. So those are my three: trustworthiness, trust, and together. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great way to start us out, Rachel. And I love the C's, the F's, and now the T's. I think maybe we could have a a whole framework around this. Maybe that'll be our next research project. A quick follow-up question for you, if I may, Rachel, before we move on to Anna. So I want to drill down a little bit on this question of trustworthiness and trust. So, when you talk about almost this crisis of trustworthiness, if you will, in multilaterals on the part of their official partners, if you were to put your finger on where that's stemming from, is it a question of trust that the priorities are aligned? Is it a question of trust in that the process is like accountable and fair and open and transparent, meaning that bilaterals are incorporated into that process? Or is it a question of performance, meaning that, yes, priorities are aligned, yes, the process is great, but we're just not delivering the results that we need in kind of a value for money sense? So, is it one of these things? Is it three of these things? What do you think?
So in true crisis form, I'm going to say it's the perfect storm, if that's all right, of all of those things that you're saying. I mean, aid money, of course, is taxpayer money. People have gone to work, they've worked hard, they've earned that money, they've paid their taxes, and those taxes are then being sent on to the multilateral system. So, of course, when there are pressures back home in domestically in donor countries to say, look, it's costing me more to pay my electricity bill, food prices are going up, inflation is getting out of control. Of course, there's going to be a lot of pressure to spend that money at home and not to spend it on multilateral system or on aid more broadly. So donors and donor governments do have to be very accountable and very mindful as well, of those domestic pressures when they're spending that money. And I'm not sure that entirely they're seeing the business case for investing in the multilateral system for all of this. Is it about not seeing their priorities reflected? Yes, I think there's two sides to that. There's also the side where decisions get taken multilaterally, most recently at COP, but also one really nice example is the migration crisis in Europe, for example, where we set policy internationally, but that doesn't make itself back into domestic policy either. So multilateral was all fine and good for norms and standards, but actually if that's not being driven back into national policy, then we really got a sort of a whole circle, whole perfect storm of issues around there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. So next I want to hear from Anna. So I think, Rachel mentioned and alluded to our Listening to Leaders survey, which, one of the interesting things I think about that is it's one of the few places where you can look at development partners across the spectrum in terms of all of the bilateral partners, as well as all of the multilaterals and all of the geographies with all of the stakeholder groups and sectors. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this checks out for you, this conversation, this topic, with what we're learning from some of our Listening to Leaders work.
First of all, thanks for having me here. I'm very happy to be in this panel. Thanks for the intro, Sam. I'll follow up on Rachel's remarks with some perspective, as Sam said, that largely derives from our Listening to Leaders survey. So what's more in the highlight, the recipient country's perspective. So I'll bring up 3 points that are somewhat aligned to the paradoxes that are identified in the Multilateral Development Finance report. So the first thing that I mentioned is the multilateral development system has never been as solicited and at the same time as contested. So there's this familiar narrative of multilateralism or financial multilateralism as being in disarray, unable to yield the beneficial results they promised on, etc. But our research really shows that multilaterals, particularly large ones, are really consistently at the top of the rankings on footprint, influence, and helpfulness. And that's been the case across several rounds of LTL from 2014 to 2017 to 2020. There's not to say that the multilaterals are perfect, but there are certainly traits of multilateral financing that they're pleasing recipient countries and driving those results. And we find that the valuing partners should be able to plan for long term, be adaptable, and even though there's a lot of question on how adaptable multilaterals are, that's what they respond, kind of related to also putting them at the top of the rankings. And also largely the generous and transparent financing. So the concessional terms that NDVs provide are certainly of value for recipient countries, and that is shown also in other research besides our own. So the discontentment seems to be coming more so from the side of the recipient countries, which brings up kind of the case for why there is such mismatch, kind of related to Sam's follow-up questions, like why are recipient countries still somewhat satisfied to that, but there's so much discontentment from donors, and where is that really stemming from? The second paradox is that despite the growing share of ODA channeled through the multilateral system, resources still fall short. So we find that large financial contributors do have more influence. And as these players jockey for influence, we can see that as a zero-sum game. As some become more influential, others become less. So the arrival of China as a major financier has really changed the landscape. Between 2017 and 2020, China moved drastically up in the rankings, and it's now in 8th place, surpassing all DAC countries with the exception of the US. So the scenario really sets higher stakes for DAC countries to play their interests, as they need greater visibility in a more crowded scenario, kind of. So working with multilaterals can dilute or mute their returns, and that reduces their interests in multilateral financing, despite the fact that there is great demand on the recipient side. So we can see some initial evidence on how bilaterals may be dealing with this changing landscape in the increase of earmarked financing, which could be, and this is somewhat speculative, but them trying to exert more control on the priorities, potentially to justify these expenses domestically. But then this ends up being an issue of the quality of money versus just more quantity. So if part of the attractiveness of multilaterals is tied to their ability to adapt, not at the project level, but at the broader level, adapt to crises and shocks, global ones, they need core funding. And the earmarking becomes a threat to what is this comparative advantage of the large multilaterals, at least as of now. And the third paradox is that while the need for reform has never been as pressing, the multilateral architecture is becoming more complex and fragmented. And we have evidence of a desire for partners to consult with other partners, of stakeholders, etc. But all of that adds a lot to the bureaucratic burden on recipients, particularly the smaller or more fragile ones, like the main, more marginalized countries that should be kind of the main target of aid. And this very fragmented portfolio becomes a huge burden. This is acknowledged by everyone often, but it's not really dealt enough on how to fix it. And as Rachel has mentioned, the report has some interesting figures on how fragmented this system is becoming, that we have this image of the large multilaterals, but there are over 100 multilaterals, just the 10 largest one, over 70% of the financing. So it might give kind of an inaccurate perception that there are not that many. So in terms of harmonization and coordination, the discussion needs to be just some extent of what does that look like? How can we effectively incorporate the needs and demands from the recipient countries without overburdening them, and still having in mind that the donor countries are also the constituencies of the MDBs from a different angle. And that's it, and I look forward for the discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Anna. I want to drill down a little bit more and just ask you to reflect on, you said that multilaterals are often at the top of the rankings, as a cohort, generally speaking, across several waves now of our Listening to Leaders survey. And we conducted the last waves in 2014, 2017, 2020, and we're working towards a new one this coming year. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the attributes that you think policymakers around the world are looking for in their preferred partners, and that might be useful to kind of reflect forward in the conversation about areas in which multilaterals might be doing better or worse.
As I mentioned before, so on some of our questions that are directly asking, what makes a valued partner, they often mention ability to plan in terms of long-term sustainability, to be adaptable, etc. But from some other research that we had, not directly on the LTL one, the SNAP poll with a similar sampling frame, we also find evidence going back to this idea of China being playing a larger role in the development financing field, that China is the preferred partner generally for energy infrastructure, which really aligns with the general perception. But there is a lot of interest still for Western partners and MDVs with similar values on the areas of governance, rule of law. And I think when we look at the distribution of actual financing, these are, in proportional terms, sometimes overlooked areas, given that is the area with many comparative advantage as of now of kind of Western partners as a group.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Anna. So Sharon, I want to go to you next. We've talked a lot about the incentives of multilaterals and whether and how multilaterals are responsive to what their counterparts in the global south are looking for, what their official contributors in the global north are looking to achieve. Tell us a little bit about what this looks like from the perspective of having done this at the World Bank for so many years, and maybe if you could reflect a little bit on like whether the World Bank is unique in this regard, or perhaps there's some similarities you see with others.
Sure, and thanks, Samantha, for that lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with everyone. And I feel like throwing my notes out that I had prepared, because I think Anna and Rachel have already gotten to a lot of what I wanted to talk about, but also I want to build on that, and I want to build on the T and the F and the C. And that would be, and I think this gets right to your question, Samantha, and that would be the P, the perception, and the perception issue. Because, you know, in a sense, all the multilaterals are, you know, going to the same sources for funding, and it's a perception game in a lot of ways. And it's the perceptions are built on data, huge amounts of data, but they're also built on this, you know, this sense of, is this institution really fit for purpose? And we all know that measuring that in poor countries is very difficult, because there's so many variables that come in. It's very hard to say how much impact these organizations have. Stepping back, I think it's something to look at in this world where you described, Samantha, is so complicated. The problems increase. I think one of the best quotes I've seen in the past few months is that which was in the World Bank's draft paper, Evolution World Map, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And it said, the 2018 capital increase was intended for one mid-sized crisis per decade, not overlapping crises. So now we're in the midst of 17 crises that are, you know, in a sense, increasing every week, every month. Good example, Pakistan. So many multilaterals are engaged in a country like Pakistan, invested heavily, and floods come, and climate change. And, you know, and then of course, all sorts of geopolitical issues engaged. So, you know, the idea that any of these multilaterals can do this on their own was really seen, in a sense, detailed in the OECD report. It comes out in the AidData work, and it came out, for instance, in CGG's wish list for the World Bank's roadmap, which came out after the draft paper was released, which is the World Bank institutions have to partner, have to organize together, have to agree that this overlapping of work is just not, in a sense, getting us to where we need to get in terms of GPGs. And that, of course, came out strongly in the OECD report. So just a few things on perceptions. What I've seen over the years of measuring the perceptions of not only stakeholders and opinion leaders in the developing countries, but now, before I left the bank, I had finally engaged a survey of influencers and stakeholders in donor countries, which was something that I had wanted to do for quite a long time. So I finally had this full circle of perceptions of stakeholders in the donor countries and stakeholders in the borrowing country. In the borrowing countries. And just a few observations. First of all, there's a gap that just won't quit in terms of what the priorities are from the World Bank, from the borrower side and from the donor side. The donors are talking about climate, they're talking about gender, they're talking about health, of course, and pandemics. The borrowers, even during the pandemic, we saw the priorities didn't change. Education, governance, agriculture, jobs. So they were still focused on key development priorities, but the donors are saying climate, climate, climate. And so that's a difficult gap to, in a sense, to bridge. It's what I call a parallel universe in terms of that you're having two different priorities, perceived priorities coming from two key stakeholder groups. Within this context, and what we're seeing, which is interesting, is that I can't even say our anymore because it's my former organization, World Bank, but the World Bank's clients, stakeholders, opinion leaders were far more positive about the institution than those stakeholders in donor countries. And as Rachel alluded to, being a parent, we know as parents that if we give our children money, they're much more judgmental about what they're doing with the money than we're judgmental with what we're doing with the money. So of course, the donors, of course, are more judgmental about what's happening on the ground. And the question is, what is their perception of how this money is being used? The borrowers feel that it's being used well. And that gap has to be somehow bridged. The donor countries, there's an expectation game. We asked what I thought was a great question, which is the World Bank meeting your expectations in these key areas, these sectoral areas? Because in the end, it's really about the bank can say, we're the biggest lender for climate, but are we meeting your expectations? And what we saw is that climate was one of the areas where we were meeting the expectations of donor country stakeholders the least. So that expectation game is really challenging and difficult. And I wish we could solve that in the next hour, and what we're down to is an hour, but it might take another conversation. And of course, COP27, that meeting just brought to the fore all of the challenges that we're facing, and back to this conversation of the need for partnership. The organizations do talk about partnership, but have the organizations really determined where they're best fit for purpose? Because I think that's where the donors are saying, you have got to determine what you're best at and you need to lead. There's some who believe the World Bank is best to lead in terms of this GPG focus that's coming out of this draft paper. Whether or not that's the case, that's one perception, that they may be best leading in certain GPG areas, global public good areas. So finally, I just want to bring it together with some suggestions I have looking forward for multilaterals. And from my perspective, it was for the World Bank. And I think these are worth having conversations about. I believe that the stories have to be told better, in a sense. We can keep throwing data at stakeholders, at opinion leaders in donor countries where they are absolutely listening to their citizens, and their citizens are talking about jobs, and they're talking about inflation, and they're talking about inflation, and they're talking about jobs. And so these stories have to be told better. And throwing bigger reports from the UN at people just isn't actually kind of moving the needle. When you look at Ipsos as what worries the world, climate's, in a sense, hasn't budged in 3 to 4 to 5 years among citizens in 30 countries. So we need to kind of help our donor countries move the needle. That's another issue, is not only do we have to tell the story, tell the data with stories, coming from voices from our clients, not our voices, not the multilateral voices. That's not important. The voices of coming from our borrowing countries. But we also have to help support our our donor country stakeholders with knowledge, with research, with data, to help them tell the story to their own constituents. And I think that's a huge role for the World Bank, for the IMF, for all of these multilaterals, to support our donor partners, to help them tell the story. We can't tell the story in the UK. The UK citizens don't care about what the World Bank thinks. The UK citizens think about what their parliamentarians think, and what their NGOs think, and what their key voices think. And finally, back to this issue of partnership and really determining who is best at different areas of work, and then working together to make this happen, leveraging the private sector and seeing that forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. A lot of great things to build upon there. I'm definitely going to be curious to hear Jason's take in a moment on the parallel universe question, because I think you may have a unique seat in that discussion. But Sharon, to you though, first, you talked about the expectations game quite a bit, and the gap between what the World Bank thinks it's supplying and what your stakeholders are looking for, either from the global north or from the global south. Where does the concept of crisis fit into this conversation as you think about what, you know, the World Bank might be good at, what the expectations are for its role? You know, to what extent is it like business as usual? You know, this is what we've always been good at. You know, it's bread and butter development issues, it's global public goods with like a long time horizon. Or, you know, is the whole question of these episodic kind of acute crises now in the mix, is that changing the way that you think the expectations are looking like for actors like the bank?
That's a great question, and it's a hard question. So thanks, early this morning. I think on the ground in borrowing countries, what we saw over the years when we would survey opinion leaders and stakeholders after there were crises in that country that the bank was engaged in heavily, the views were quite positive. So in other words, if there, you know, a huge earthquake in Turkey or, you know, a big flood, the data would come back. We would then that year survey on the bank's involvement in that, and the views would be quite positive. So that's on a micro level, essentially. In terms of the expectations of the more global public good issues, those were questions that we actually had just started asking in the global north, not the global south, and they may be doing that now in the global south. You know, when I look at the numbers, when I think of crises, I think climate, I think fragility, I think even pandemic preparedness, migration. In those areas, the bank scored the lowest in terms of whether it's meeting the meeting expectations. So migration's huge, fragility is huge, climate's huge, income inequality, migration. The areas where the bank was meeting expectations were in those bigger institutional issues, I want to say, trade, economic management, human capital, health, so systems. The bank is perceived as very, I think, from my perspective, is perceived very positively when it comes to systems, you know, helping support health systems, education systems. And Rachel and Jason and Anna can actually push back on this, and from their perspective, they may have a different view. But when it comes to sort of those crises, and again, this gets back to, is it really the bank's role to engage at that level? Certainly we've promoted were promoted as an institution that's working in fragility and working hard at it. It's a demand by the donors. And it's a huge area of emphasis, which the nexus is with climate there, of course. So I would say on a micro level from the global south, it's positive, but it's not necessarily lasting. It's per incident, it's anecdotal. And then from the global north, I think on those big issues that they have to go back to their constituents and talk about, migration, fragility, things like that, less so.
Great, thanks so much for that, Sharon. So Jason, over to you, kind of teeing you up here. Parallel universe. So what's it like to straddle the worlds of the expectations of a rather large bilateral actor, and yet also kind of working within and constructively with other bilaterals in the context of a multilateral like the ADB? So Jason, over to you.
So I'm going to start out and like just, if they just listened to the United States, everything would be great. You know, first and foremost, I say that just because that's not the reality of these institutions. Sharon, I think you realize, like, you know, if everyone listened to the U.S. executive director, you know, everything would be fine. And same thing in Rachel's organization at the U.S. ambassador to the OECD, and so on and so forth. But that's not the reality. The reality is that these institutions are viewed as trustworthy actors by the recipient countries or the borrowing countries. But I think the challenge in this overall system is, you know, certain NDBs are more trusted than others. You know, I saw that firsthand where, you know, in Asia, you know, the ADB is somewhat a little bit more valued than the World Bank. And clearly, like, I believe the ADB is more valued than the AIIB. But that's also, you know, a personal political perspective that I have. But I think the challenges always have been, you know, the overall envelope by which the World Bank, ADB, and other NDBs, how they come up with their country partnership framework, the country partnership strategies. It's a finite amount of resources over a 5-year period of time that you deliver, that you have for these specific countries. So the borrowing countries have to be very specific in what they want and what they ask. So when you have these types of global shocks, it's almost impossible, if not really difficult, to change, and move the needle to, you want to build a $500 million bridge. Well, COVID hit. Well, we need that 500. We need to reprogram that money for $500 million budget support. Now, institutions like ADB, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others are designed for these types of things. That's the one positive aspect of these institutions, that the system was created so they can deal with these types of these shocks to the global system. And plus, they have the ability to provide counter-cyclical support, which is what's needed in times like this. I think the challenge is for a donor country or representing a donor country, it's okay. Well, I'm all for providing borrowing countries this type of budget support, but from my perspective, it's are we throwing good money after bad? And how are we going to ensure that the necessary safeguards or guardrails are there in order for them to ensure that the money gets to where it needs to be? And so that I have to go back, because it's been a while since I actually had to do this and approve these types of things. But it was always a challenge for me that you have a lot of borrowing countries who are deeply in need, and I'm cognizant of that, and I was sympathetic to that. But it's where are we going to ensure that this money gets to? Is it to various constituencies and the subnational level, and so on and so forth? So from my perspective, or when I was at the ADB, it was the money is important, but let's focus on the governance, let's focus on the policy initiatives, and possibly can we add some capacity building support in order to ensure that borrowing countries get the help they need in the actual large allocation of money, but also that when these occurrences occur, and we all know that they're going to occur again, that they are more adept in dealing with them themselves as well. I'll kind of leave it there because I know we want to get to a bunch of questions from the audience, and I know you have some follow-up questions as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. That's super helpful as expected. I'm curious to hear you react a little bit actually to something that Rachel said in her remarks, this idea of earned autonomy, which I thought was quite intriguing, especially as we talk about and for those of you that are deep in the realm of financing for development, you're like, oh yes, earmarking. I know all the ins and outs of that. And for others of you on the call, you might be like, what is this earmarking that we're talking about? So essentially, as you look at the Multilateral Development Finance report, interesting finding around the fact that the overall volume of assistance via multilaterals is increasing in terms of assistance from official contributors. But of course, there's also an uptick of earmarking, which effectively reduces the discretion of those multilaterals to channel those funds in ways they see fit. And so it ties back, I think, to what Rachel had to say about earned autonomy. Curious to hear your take on whether that's a viable or attractive proposition.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge because, in my perspective, we don't want these institutions to be autonomous. You need the political support from donor countries and recipient countries in order for these institutions to run, first and foremost. And the whole idea of earmarking, I wish it was that easy, only because, at some point when the money gets delivered to the institution, the money then becomes fungible. And then the idea that, if you can earmark, you have to have extreme amount of oversight, more so than the US offices or donor country offices at these institutions, because their staff resources are finite as well. I do think, in terms of earmarking, you may not, I don't think you can earmark specific projects. I think that's near impossible to do and shouldn't be done. But I think the way earmarking can be done is on the policy objectives of the institutions, whether, you want to see more infrastructure. For me, it's like this. I wish I could earmark, our contribution, and I can ensure additional coal projects took place, right? But institutions like the ADB and others are never going to go for that. But I think the earmarking can take place where you make a sizable contribution from donor countries, you earmark the policy aspects and safeguards aspects of these institutions. And I think that's where it's generally done when the policy reviews come up. I do think it's a little bit of a slippery slope, because when you have countries like rising countries like China, it becomes a little bit of a geopolitical, a potential geopolitical quagmire, because they have their own self-interest, their own political interest, and that will definitely be a challenge to the United States, potentially Japan, and some in Europe as well. So, that's why a lot of these institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, ADB, they try to kind of have that narrow scope in what donor countries can do in terms of earmarking. Otherwise, it opens up a whole new ballgame. I do think, where the proper type of earmarking takes place is when you go through the country partnership framework, country partnership strategies, where recipient countries can dictate what type of projects, what type of loans, what type of initiatives they want from the institutions. And that's where, donor countries along with the recipient countries can get together and decide, what the best path forward, what the specific projects will be, and what the overall envelope size for, a 5-year period of time is going to look like. Obviously, you could stick to that 5-year time with a certain envelope, that would be great. But in this day and age, with these types of global shocks, there has to be adaptability, which is always going to be a challenge at these institutions as well.
Great, thanks, Jason. Now I want to start to bring in the rest of the panel to discuss a couple of sub-themes, and then those of you that are also joining us in our virtual room, definitely be keeping your ears open for things that resonate with you, that you want to build an example or a stat or continue that thread, or things that you are a big, massive red light and you're like, no way, I have counter views on this, and I want to push the debate a little bit more. But Rachel, going back to you a little bit on this question of earmarking, and earned autonomy. So is earmarking, in your view, is it reflective of distrust from, official contributors to multilaterals? Is it a way of rebuilding trust? And, as you think about this in the context of crises, does this make it easier or harder for multilaterals to be adaptable in crises? What do you think?
Thanks, that's a great question. Earmarking is a big issue, I suppose, possibly more for the UN system than it is for vertical funds and for the MDBs. It's certainly a big issue in the crisis space, where nearly everything is earmarked. And I'm, for example, reviewing IOM at the moment. They're sitting on a portfolio of 96% earmarked at the moment. So, these kind of situations do call for a different type of organization, an organization that can provide, as Jason pointed out, the additional oversight that is required to be able to not only accept these earmarks, but also report on them in a certain way, make sure they're delivered in a certain way. And you're right, there is less adaptation available. If there is suddenly as was pointed out before, an infrastructure program going on and suddenly there's a flood, you can't just, pitch or pivot your funding for the infrastructure into flood response immediately without a conversation with your donor, if you like. I think earmarking, though, is a symptom rather than the cause. I think earmarking happens because the donor side of the equation feel like what they would like multilateral organizations and the system writ large to focus on are not happening. And therefore, the only way they can get that to happen, because they can't get it to happen through governance structures, is by having these earmarks, which then direct, because that's the way the money's coming, to operate in a certain way. I think, as I was saying before, I think the only way around that really is not a direction from the heads of UN agencies and other multilaterals to say, stop earmarking to us. It's more about this relationship between trust and trustworthiness, and building the trustworthiness of the organizations, which then allows, and the governance structures, then allows the donors to set the right direction for the organization, ensure the organization is working with others that are working in the same sectors or places or on the same issues, but allowing it more freedom to deliver And I think that's possibly the only way out of this cycle, which I think is almost a death spin downhill at the moment. Yes, I think that's really what I would say about earmarking. I think it certainly is an issue, but it's not the cause, I don't think, of where we're at today.
Thanks, Rachel. And just as a broad note to all the panelists, feel free if you're like, I want in on this, two-finger it, whatever it might be, go ahead and signal to me, give me the high sign. Oh, okay, Jason, jump right in.
Well, I mean, I think the challenge with earmarking though is, as Rachel aptly pointed out, but I think earmarking comes to a head because you have the political systems in donor countries who view a lot of these institutions with, and maybe that's where the distrust comes from, the political machinations in specific countries. And so in order to, potentially just prove a point, they earmark funds for, specific organizations. And so, I think there's a challenge there. The other aspect of earmarking, and something that I heard a few months ago, was, I think donors will earmark to set a priority or to jumpstart a priority as well. And so, to get some of these MDBs or other institutions to move a little bit faster, providing them an incentive. So there's an incentive structure there. But again, the challenge is, as we said earlier, are these institutions fit for purpose? Are they overly bureaucratic? I don't know if anyone said that, so I said it. So I think there's a challenge there. Can they take the money and move fast enough and deliver the projects? And so I think there's a host of challenges there when earmarks take place, and same thing for certain types of trust funds that are created through these institutions as well.
Yeah, Sharon, go ahead.
Yeah, within this context of this conversation and focusing on the T of trust, Rachel, I have a question for you, actually, and Jason as well, actually, from your perspective. This is a world in which there's no trust of any institutions. It's not just about multilaterals and bilaterals, and it's about government, it's about media, it's about private sector. So how do the multilaterals, build trust? What are the key drivers of trust? And is it really possible, in a sense, to attain trust when our stakeholders and the multilateral stakeholders in donor countries are simply driven by a lack of trust, even of them, as well as their own institutions? So just a bigger, sort of more philosophical view of trust in this age of lack of trust.
So I think the challenges with this is, like, we're trying to look at trust in a kind of this holistic global setting. But I think if we look at trust from MDB to donor, MDB to recipient country, there's trust there, and there's also trust in the institution, in MDBs, that they are going to do the right thing within a certain parameter. These institutions are run by people, like good-natured, decent people who want to do the right thing. Yet bureaucracy takes over, personal political perspectives take over, but the overall mission stays the same. But I think overall, these are trusted partners. I think where it gets challenged for these institutions is when you have G7 countries with like someone said earlier about a climate agenda that run contrary to what the needs are in the developing world. And if you get into certain issues regarding certain safeguards, and then you put them into a religious context, that also, I would not say it sows distrust, but it sows something that creates a little bit of hardship that may not be there. So in a way, if a lot of these institutions took a step back, worked on what they were intended to do, back when the Bretton Woods system was created, perhaps that's the baseline by which we need to go back to. I'm not advocating that we step back and go to the 40s and 50s and 60s, but I'm saying that we have to look at the system as a whole and figure out where, what policies, what areas that we're looking into that create the most contempt in this global perspective. Because I do think there's trust there between NDB and recipient, NDB and donors overall. But I think there's a lot more distrust between donor and NDB than recipient and NDB.
Thanks, Jason, for that. I'm going to ask Rachel to chime in as well, but also wanted to give Anna and Sharon a heads up. So a great question came in through the chat Q&A that I thought you could reflect a little bit on from what you know from your interactions with stakeholders in the Global South in terms of what are some tangible ways in which multilaterals can build trust with their partners. So what does trustworthiness look like? What does credibility, desirability for partnership look like from the perspective of these constituents? Maybe also have you reflect a little bit on this, Rachel, like, okay, if the trust is an issue, well, what would be a sign of good faith?
Thanks, and these are really good questions and actually really hard ones too. So things to think about, I think, going forward. I mean, Anna mentioned before the huge demand and also the huge pressure on the multilateral system at the moment, which is true. And Sharon actually brought up the question of expectations. So I wanted to go into that a bit as well around, how do we build trust? Because there are these enormous expectations and almost impossible demands to deliver. I mean, if I think that, before 2030, we're going to have to have achieved apparently, all of Agenda 2030. I look back at sort of between 1986 and 1990 or something and think, did we actually make those massive leaps in that 6-year time frame? I mean, maybe we're asking too much, is perhaps where we need to start from and perhaps get a little bit. I mean, it's great to be ambitious, but let's be realistic and pragmatic perhaps as well. And I wonder if something we need to do is actually to sort of counter this huge expectation issue around sort of defining more clearly what does good performance look like. So, what does a good functioning organization look like? What sort of standards and benchmarks should it be holding it to itself to? And then therefore, if it has achieved those things, should we be asking more, or should we just be saying, well, that's all right now? And I think that's what MOPAN is going to look at doing over the next year as we look forward to our new strategy, is trying to define more clearly what a good functioning multilateral organization and a good functioning multilateral system looks like, so that we can sort of I suppose squeeze down a little bit this expectation gap between you've got to be everything to everyone and you've got to deliver now, even in times of pandemic, to something that's a little bit more realistic, and to see, actually what good performance really should look like. So maybe that's part of the answer at least, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Sharon, I think that sets you up really nicely. So what does good performance look like?
Well, I think it's a really great point in terms of start to more clearly define these key performance indicators in a sense. I think it's challenging because, the ADB's key performance indicators are different from the World Bank's, from the IMF's. There's a lot of mission creep on the part of organizations. So that demand from donors will have to be quite insistent. And in a sense, in the past few years, I think we've seen the demand. I think that the big multilaterals can sit there rather comfortably and say, look, we're the only games in town. There are about 10 of us, and we're the big, kids in the neighborhood, and we know that the funding is going to keep coming. But the UK has certainly made it clear that that's not true, and now Sweden. So I do think now this is a time where multilaterals have to reflect and say, yeah, we have to help the MOPANs and the OECDs help together define these indicators. This isn't something that one side should do or the other. It's working, collaborating, partnering to determine what are the key indicators for specific organizations. And then with the ability to show that, to measure that, by creating indicators that you can't measure, everyone gets frustrated in a sense. And there'll be plenty that you can't measure because things like pandemics happen, and it's hard to measure how effective these organizations are in the midst of a pandemic 2 months in, when no one even understands the pandemic. So I think there's that realistic shift. One thing I wanted to comment on, something that you raised prior to Rachel's response, was related to how do you build trust in the global South. You know, if there's one finding I will stand by that never fails to perform is this issue of familiarity for the World Bank. And I suspect for other big development, the 10 big players. The more, well, for a while, I did some qualitative work over at the IMF when I was at the bank, and this didn't quite emerge. But having said that, in most cases, familiarity is the key to positive views. You know, I can never prove that it's causal, but gosh, it's correlated every single time. And the more familiar stakeholders are, opinion leaders are with the institution, the more positive they are about every aspect, all of the key indicators we looked at: responsiveness, flexibility, effectiveness, value, etc. So I go back to the issue that I raised. We have to be able to tell stories in a way, and we have to be able to engage with partners that go beyond that little inner circle. We talk to ourselves a lot, people on both sides of the sort of equation. We talk to others who believe in what we believe in. We talk to those in the global South who believe in what we believe in, and we don't necessarily get outside of that first or second concentric circle. And we need to start reaching beyond the people that we're comfortable with to start telling the story. So that familiarity issue will really help and it's not just a communications issue. Obviously, the work has to be done on the ground, and the results have to be there, and the impact has to be there. But I do think that this issue of familiarity, building sustainable relationships that allow for partnerships and collaboration on the ground, that allow for country-driven strategies, that will be really key in the global South.
Thanks, Sharon. That's really helpful. And I'm really pleased to see already we've got some excellent questions popping into the chat. We can start broadening the discussion now. Definitely, if you're listening in, you have questions, reactions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and then I'll try to sprinkle those in and maybe ask you to unmute and share them with the panelists yourself as we go forward. So, but before we do that, Anna, I want to hear your thought. You know, there's these questions out there right now on what does trust look like? How do you build trust? And what does performance look like? And it occurs to me, if we're defining performance, we need to be thinking about that not only from the perspective of the global North, but also the global South. So what does good performance, trustworthiness look like from your vantage point?
Yes, so on the trustworthiness, I think from the recipient side, it's pretty clear what they want. It's like consultations, incorporating local voices, national priorities. I think the main point on this is not how to be trusted, it's just how not to add too much burden so that the fragmentation becomes the main problem. I don't think there's much question on what the recipient countries want. I think on the donor side is much more complicated. I think personally that priorities is one of the main issues, and the practitioners can correct me if they have different views. But I think the mismatch in priorities is a main issue. And if I'll add more problem than so many things by saying that I think particularly on the issue of climate, there is this view from the global North as a major priority that will, I think, always be seen with some extent with backlash from the global South, that we got into this because of you to some extent, which makes it very hard to bring this up as a priority when it's not yet. There are more urgent, pressing matters from the views of the global South, and it's a priority from the global North that they don't see themselves as the cause of it. So there's a broader kind of like generational almost issue to when this problem was raised and who has to pay for the results of it. I think the only kind of idea that I have from how to move forward in terms of this is, but it might be a naive view on how we incorporate in the same kind of like policies or projects the priorities of both sides, maybe be better at figuring out how to tie climate adaptation actions with job creation, which is non-trivial, I realize, but I don't see any other way out, because I don't think this is something that can be fixed in the short term. Maybe when the next generation is in the positions of power, they will be concerned enough with climate change to fix it. But as is now, I don't think the leaders in the global south would be like, yes, climate change is our number one priority on how to deal with it right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna, for that pragmatic response and trying to thread the needle between all of these different stakeholders. I want to go ahead and open it up to some of the folks in the virtual room here that have started to pose some questions, and I'll continue to pepper questions. For those of you that have a burning question that are listening in, do leverage that Q&A. I am looking at it religiously, and you can also use the raise hand function. Why don't we take two questions that I do see already from others. Alexis Clare from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, if you're on the line, would you mind unmuting and perhaps sharing your video if you're in a good place to pose your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Great. I don't think I have a video option, so I will stick with audio for now. But I was really interested in this defining of the KPIs and not knowing kind of what the cross MDB collaboration looks like. Personally, I was curious, is this something that MDBs actually gather to set out to do? And if it does, is this the type of thing that happens at the IMF World Bank annual meetings coming up in April? Which led me to think, what are your priorities for those meetings? I'd be curious to hear what you want to happen at those meetings and kind of the role that maybe your institutions are thinking about or playing when it comes to setting the agenda for those meetings and the outcomes you're hoping to see. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the great question. Rachel, why don't we go to you first? Do you have a thought on this kind of from your vantage point in the world?
So I think someone else will have to answer the question about whether the MDBs get together and define their KPIs jointly. I suspect not, but perhaps I can be proven wrong. Certainly, we have just conducted assessments and they'll be released very soon. So around the times of the spring meetings, I'm just looking at the list now of IDB Invest, the World Bank, and also the African Development Bank is coming up shortly as well. And there'll be a couple of other MDBs this year. And we have had to adapt quite significantly the framework that MOPAN uses for assessing, or the methodology, if you like, we use for assessing those organizations and whether they're fit for purpose and driving results, because the MDB situation is so different, I guess, to other actors in the multilateral system, which I guess is normal. So I think what will be useful about those assessments is what it shows about whether those organizations are actually fit for purpose to drive forward on the evolution roadmap. To see whether it's not just about how you define your programming, but also how you are set up as an institution to be able to deliver on those lofty goals. I would agree KPI is very important, but perhaps someone else can help me out about whether that's set jointly or not. But certainly for us, we had to do a whole new exercise for those organizations.
Sharon, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I know you've talked about the evolution roadmap in some of our correspondence before, but yeah, reflecting on Rachel's comments and then the broader question from Alexis Clare.
So I'm not with the bank anymore, just to make that clear, but I was for many years. I think at the beginning, at the country strategy, at the upstream, when multilaterals are all engaged with the country itself, figuring out what the strategy will be, what the priorities will be. I think they all set, in a sense, a roadmap, but they are certainly responding, I think, to their own KPIs. So they're not saying, gee, how are we doing over at the ADB? Are we all working together on these KPIs? Because the demands are so different from their constituencies, internal and external. Another important issue to talk about, which we may not have time to do today, which is the internal stakeholders and how much they're driving the conversation for these institutions, what they want out of the institutions, and where they think the institution should go, because they end up being ambassadors for that. I don't think they're measuring together. And I do think, per Rachel's point, that if the evolution roadmap is indeed the bank's way of saying, we recognize that there's a new way that's necessary, a very new way to do business that's necessary. When you read the draft paper and you see CGD's response, and you look at the OECD paper from November, it all points to, if you're not going to partner, if you're not going to leverage, we're going to be faced with a multitude of crises, and we're not going to be able to solve them because there's simply not enough money and resources and agreement. So
Jason, do you have thoughts on this?
And Sharon, you didn't mention Ukraine reconstruction on top of that as well. So like that's like the giant elephant in the room that all the institutions have to kind of come to grips with in the short, medium, and even long term. So to the question itself, so I think something needs to be clarified. I mean, when borrowing countries go to the various different institutions, they're not looking at the same projects unless the World Bank and another NDB partner up for the financing needs, which often occurs. And so a lot of the KPIs will be different because the World Bank will be doing a project in a specific country. The ADB will be doing a different project, on infrastructure, whereas the World Bank may be doing an energy project. So the KPIs are generally going to be different anyway. I think when someone who's attended many of these meetings, the MDB heads all get together when during the spring meeting and the fall meeting, and they discuss their overall priorities of the institutions, but they also discuss a lot of the global economic issues, whether it be inflation, the Russia-Ukraine war and the overall impacts of COVID, healthcare issues, and so on and so forth. So they stick to these broader, higher level topics. And I think at the working levels, I know that there are discussions about KPIs, about targets, about indicators, and they try to marry them up as much as possible, but the indicators are there for the recipient or the borrowing countries to kind of adhere to, and so in a way that they're never going to be on par between the institutions, which makes a lot of reading for the donor countries, because they got to ensure that that whatever they're doing at the ADB is, they got to correlate that to what they're doing at the World Bank and correlate that with at the Inter-American Development Bank and so on and so forth. I think part of the biggest challenge though right now is, and I think Adeshina in the African Development Bank could potentially be kind of that lone voice of defending the global South on issues related to climate, because while I think all African nations all understand these issues, as Anna pointed out, it's his borrowing countries are going to be adversely affected by a significant number of these climate mandates by the donor countries. And I think that's a challenge for him. And I know that will probably come up at the NDB heads meeting, and that's going to come up on the sidelines of the G20, G7, World Bank, IMF meetings, and so on and so forth.
Thanks for that, Jason. I want to go ahead now and ask Yan Wang if you're still in the virtual room here. I think you are. You posed a great question in the chat. I'll let you unmute yourself. If you do have video access, great. If not, that's fine as well. But I think that adds another piece to the discussion here, which is when we're talking a lot about trust, but trust is partly about communicating and being clear about expectations, and that you will follow through, but it's also equally about that follow through. It's not just what you say, but what you do. So Yanwan, I think your question really hits at this. So why don't you go ahead and pose your thoughts to the panelists?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Yeah, I prefer not to show my face, but I'm from Boston University and originally from China. So I think trust and togetherness are important, but IMF's performance is poor, especially during the Asian financial crisis. Now, in the face of multiple poly crises, the IMF's disbursement, the net disbursement is very disappointing. It's declining, and also the World Bank's AidData net disbursement is also declined, has also declined in 2022. So I think the performance is kind of their lending is not counter-cyclical as we expected. So the partner countries, the shareholders are not satisfied. So I think they need some reform, and I don't see any reform in the horizon. The IMF is still charging high surcharges. So professors like Stiglitz and Kevin Gallagher has already pointed out that the IMF should reduce the surcharges, but no reform is in sight. I don't think the trust is being built. Anyway, what do you think?
Excellent question, Yanwen. Easy softball for our panelists to address. Maybe, if I could kind of shape how we handle this, I'm curious to maybe tackle it in two different ways, but you all are the experts. I'm just here to facilitate. One would be to answer the question head on, which is about this very specific example that Yanwen gave a really nice explanation about, the challenges with the IMF's perceived performance with regard to providing this counter-cyclical support, helping countries navigate indebtedness, helping countries navigate financial crises, right? So there's a sense of discontentment there, promises of reform, those promises do not appear to be fulfilled. So any thoughts that you have on that particular case, great. But I think also it broadens the discussion also to this question that, calls for reform are not unique to the IMF or to the question of debt and financial stability. So as you kind of look across the multilateral system and MDBs specifically, these questions of what reforms have been called for, how well are multilaterals doing in delivering on that, and how does that affect this broader question of trust and responsiveness? So throwing it open to the panel here, who'd like to take a crack at this? Go ahead, Anna.
If I can start on the specific of the IMF and showing some data to support your point, but also to counter it. So the IMF really ranks as the top influencer as a development partner across kind of regions and sectors very consistently. And it does rank much lower in helpfulness. And it's one of the few multilaterals that actually, if we adjust for positivity or negativity, the influence goes down. Nevertheless, it is at the very top. And I think to some extent, the perceptions maybe will one day matter, but to a large extent, the IMF is playing in certain countries that in the rising crisis, so that other development partners may not be arriving. So I think to some extent, the influence level that they hold will remain reform or no reform.
Yeah, great points, Anna. I think, reflecting on some of those same findings that I've seen, our running hypothesis, I think, to try to explain that has been, to Anna's point specifically, when it comes to countries in financial crises, there are limited players that are as dominant as the IMF. So they're there, they're highly influential, but then often, that assistance comes with prescriptions of sometimes painful reforms that countries have to undertake. So I can understand the reaction on perhaps whether this is helpful or not. Rachel, I saw you perk up at this question. Do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, not on the IMF specifically, but perhaps on the second part of the question that you asked, Sam, which I thought was really interesting. And a shout out to Jason for the big elephant in the room of the Ukraine recovery plan, which I think when we were working on it last year, we had a bill of about 750 billion at that point. And of course, the war has significantly escalated since then with significant more loss and damage in the energy sector. So there's going to be a huge drain of resources towards Ukraine at some point, and whether that's 750 billion or not, that's still an enormous amount of money. I think, coming back to the T of together, and this is my personal reflection, I suppose, rather than something I've heard so much from the members, but it is really interesting to see how when we look at crises, before, So, in 10 years ago, we would have looked very squarely at the UN system, not financial crises necessarily, but, pandemics and flooding in Pakistan and, big earthquakes and conflicts. We would have been looking squarely at the UN to be delivering solutions to those things. And that would be the conversation that would be where the funding would be going. And this is where, everything would be happening. There has been a pivot in the system where, a large amount of that demand now, or that request, if you like, is going to the MDBs. What can you do about COVID? 10 years ago would have been a question for the UN to answer. What can you do about COVID this time around was a question very much for the MDBs and the IFIs. Where did that happen and why did that happen? Is it because we lost confidence in the UN system to be able to deliver? Is it just because these things take so much money that perhaps only MDBs can sort of have that kind of absorption capacity and leverage capacity? I don't know. Was it actually a thought out decision and pivot, or did it just kind of happen? I suspect it happened with one of the AIDA replenishments a little not so far long ago. But is that actually where we want to be going forward? Do we want to be leaving all of this in the hands of the MDBs and the IFIs and have the UN agencies essentially come begging for money to the MDBs and IFIs to be able to deliver their programs? Or do we have to have a rethink about how crisis response is actually done with the system bringing all its assets together in the right way? So anyhow, more a question, sorry, than an answer at this point, but I do find it interesting to see how we've made this pivot. The donors have made this pivot in the way they funded. Systems made this pivot. Is it the right pivot? I'm not entirely sure. We probably need institutions that are adaptable, flexible, and nimble to be able to respond to Pakistan flooding and et cetera, rather than big. Somebody used the word bureaucratic before, but the big bureaucratic structures that on the other side. Anyhow, a question more than an answer. Sorry.
Sharon, go ahead and react if you like.
Sure. I think the IMF example is interesting. I think the IMF has a couple things. I think that the IMF has generated a lot of conversation about governance, meaning internal governance. And that's something at the bank as well, at a lot of big multilaterals. Really, are the shareholders really represented in a fair way? And I still think that that's another elephant in the room, a pale gray elephant in the room, shall I say? Because I don't think that a lot of stakeholders out there believe, and ones with very loud voices and prominent voices and influence, believe that these institutions are represented the way they should be. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's an interesting thing to look at the way the IMF has, shall I say, pivoted a bit in terms of, and we would joke about this across 19th Street, because in Washington, D.C., for those online who don't know, the IMF sits on one side, on the west side of 19th Street, and the bank sits on the east side of 19th Street. And we say that across 19th Street, with Kristalina at the helm, and even Christine Lagarde, they really took on development issues more than others had in the past. Christine Lagarde really took on the gender issue, really took on the climate issue. And this has been, in a sense, supported and moved forward by Kristalina Georgieva. So that's an interesting pivot. What that will look like, what that means in a new world of where there's finance needed and emphasis on climate and other issues, it'll be interesting to see where that player falls out, particularly within the context of what Anna said, which is they're always seen as having great influence. Whether they're helpful or not is another issue. So I think that's an interesting pivot to look at, because in contrast to other multilaterals, they seem to be doing something slightly more different than others have in the past. And it seems to be working for them on the global, sort of on the global stage. So that was more of a question that I left you with than an answer.
Jason, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so this goes to the ideas, of mission creep. In a way, I think there, I know I shared this view that when did the IMF become an MDB? Yeah, I said it. Okay, so I think I said what a lot of us are thinking, but I think the whole idea of trust. I mean, I think all of us remember that if you go to Indonesia, the IMF is no longer welcome in the country of Indonesia. And potentially that could be the case in Pakistan if Pakistan was not in such a dire situation. Because, and I'm not saying that, that the rules attached by the IMF are not correct or they're not appropriate. It's just that, it's kind of like do as I say instead of we will help you through this. And I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of countries in the global South. I think, a similar point is, when Rachel discussed like, why are countries coming to the MDBs, for COVID funding and so on and so forth. Well, I think it has to do with the fact that, they're the closest people around for a lot of these host country governments. Because the World Bank, the ADB, and others, they all have offices in these countries, and they know that the money is going to be readily accessible because they're also donors and they're also recipients. But also from a funding standpoint, the MDBs come with relatively inexpensive money for them to go do the things that they need to do. So cheap money really talks to a lot of these countries because a lot of these countries with everything that they're going through, they're price conscious, they're cost conscious, and so I think it's important to know that in a way the MDBs are the lender of first resort and the lender of last resort, which is what I believe the system was intended. And then you just got to figure out kind of the governance stuff in between first and last, and so that's an important thing to note when you're managing relationships between countries, MDBs, donors, and MDBs, and so on and so forth. That this is a system that was intended. Fortunately or unfortunately, this is the reality of it.
Thanks so much for that, Jason. I was going to pose a question to you all, but there's a great one in the chat here that I think would be great, would be challenging but useful for a speed round question for you. And then I'll take the last 30 seconds before we sign off to wrap up. So this is a question, and I would call on them, but it says anonymous attendee, so I'll just roll with it myself. So it's a question about like, how do you seriously, pragmatically build trust, maintain trust in the face of unpredictable and sometimes adversarial domestic political cycles in donor countries? So this isn't even about global shocks to the system per se, or environmental shocks in a country, but this is domestic political cycles. How do you build trust, sustain it, working through multilaterals when politics is cyclical? Curious to have folks give their round robin 30-second reactions to that, your prescription. Let's start with you, Jason.
I'm still reading the question. So
I tried to distill it for you.
I think this poses the biggest challenge in donor countries, domestic political priorities. And so I think the challenge thing here is when we're focusing on inflation, rising costs of literally everything, educational issues, you name it, whatever we're going through domestically in the United States, that's always going to be paramount. And so if you're a policymaker or a policy leader, what are you going to do first? You're going to focus on rerouting resources from something international that the American public does not know a lot about, and this could be in any country, towards something to domestic. And I think we covered that early. But the overall issue is, is that good for potential our standing in the world? But at the end of the day, leaders are going to lead on how they see fit, and that's part of the challenge. But how do you put that? How do you come to grips with all these different competing interests in a bilateral setting or in a domestic setting when you have multilateral and bilateral priorities that you have to figure out too?
Rachel, thoughts on this question?
I'm really encouraged by what we've been talking about today, because we are all committed to multilateralism, right? All of us sitting here. We'd like to make it work better, obviously. Jason's just going, maybe not. Anyhow, certainly I am. But we do need to make the case. I think we'll have our political leaders at home make the case, as Jason said, that solving problems like cost of living crisis, et cetera, are better done together than separately. And that's a narrative that I think we need to develop. Help our political leaders at home post that narrative, and sell that narrative to voters and to taxpayers, I guess, at the end of the day. And I'm wondering now, and I'm going to take this away from myself, is whether we need to get some kind of pledge together between the donors to say, okay, this is why I believe in multilateralism, and to do it in the right way, provide the right incentives and the right financing. I'm going to do this, this, and this. So maybe that's something for me to take away and have a work on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We are at time, but Sharon, Anna, I think that there's an excellent question in the chat that it would be useful to, even if you want to scribble a note or two in response to Paul's great question about how multilateral development banks can increase the discipline of focusing on outcomes. Curious to hear your thoughts on that, but others on the panel can do the same. This has been a fabulous discussion. It's always great when you have more questions left on the table that you want to answer that you didn't get to, rather than crickets. Just quickly, in my 30-second wrap up, a couple of key themes that I heard that we can continue the conversation moving forward with our Listening to Leaders work, the OECD's Multilateral Development Finance work, MOPAN, and many, many others. Trust. This is about the intersection between familiarity and follow through. Expectations, and the expectations game came up kind of continuously. And how do you reconcile the fact that you may have multiple expectations from different stakeholders in the global north and global south? This question came up about performance. How do you define it, and who defines it? And is it static, or is it changing in the context of these crises that we're navigating? And adaptability, this question of the balancing act between the need for discretion and accountability when being adaptable and responsive to what countries need and want in crisis. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. Super helpful, super interesting. We will have a video recording of the session available on AidData.org, probably later today or this week. We hope you'll take a look at that, look at the relevant reports, and promote them widely to your friends. And let us know what you thought about the event today, if you have other things that you'd like to see us tackle together with this group or others. With that, I'm Samantha Custer from AidData. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you. Take care.